In year 2000, Jan Tomasz Gross published a thin book entitled Neighbors, the Destruction of the Jewish Community in Jedwabne, which initiated a discussion that was thus far the longest, most thorough and most intense discussion regarding the Polish Jewish past. The events described by Gross took place in Jedwabne, a small town in northeast Poland. It was inhabited by more than 2,000 people, many of whom were Jews. On the 10th July 1941, Polish inhabitants carried out a pogrom on their Jewish neighbors. Hundreds were murdered, including some 300 people burned alive in a barn. The exact number was established at a later time. Gross's account was based on the previous one, and so he claimed that 1,600 people had died. The statement that Poles were the perpetrators excited most controversy in the public opinion. A number of historians and publicists who disputed Gross's claims in defense of the paradigm of Polish innocence tried to ensure that the German troops were present in Jedwabne and that they forced locals to undertake the actions. Others claimed that it was the Germans who committed the crime. The dispute regarding Poles' participation in the extermination of Jews, which then broke out, had its impact on the shape of Polish playwriting at the beginning of the 21st century. The corpus of plays connected with the Poles' mass murder committed there consists of 5 texts. Of the 5, only one, that is, Our Class by Tadeusz Łobodzianek, has entered the mainstream of theatre life, whilst also achieving international recognition. The other 3, that is Piotrowicki's Mykwa, Małgorzata Sikorska-Miszczuk's Burmistrz, the Mayor, and Burmistrz, część druga, the Mayor Part 2, can only be found on the fringes of the theatrical reception, have been published or presented in the forms of readings, single stagings, and radio broadcasts. All the texts appear to define the Polish collective identity rather than the Jewish identity, or strive to present both perspectives, which facilitates their inclusion of predominantly educational and informational stories with a clearly set and somewhat reparative potential. This statement might also be applied to Miserere Mei by Kazimierz Brakoniecki, which was the first of the post-Jedwabne plays, as it was published in 2001. Much earlier than the text mentioned before, it focuses mainly on the shock caused by the revelation of the truth about the past, and thus complete destruction of the imagination about it and the guilt it evokes. The expressions in it are influenced by the situation in which Brakoniecki sets his characters. The plot is set in the late 1970s in a provincial psychiatric hospital which has a new patient called Andrzej. He suffers from depression and suicidal thoughts, which became part of his life when he overheard his father and paternal uncle mention their participation in pogroms. An individual experience of confronting the truth is embedded in the categories of community. Quote, I felt immense guilt that I, my family, so normal, Catholic, and all of a sudden its other face, the gory one. This is a reflection of the compulsory national narrative, which casts Germans for the role of executioners and Poles for the role of passive witnesses. Whereas in Gross's book, the perpetrator is a Polish neighbor, a human like us, capable of joining their compatriots in a mass murder of racial character. Moreover, there is a significant part referring to the affective sphere in Brakoniecki's play. The main character confesses to the psychologist that he has committed an insane act of digging up bones from the place where the murdered Jews were buried and subsequently taking them to Krakow, where he buried them at the Jewish cemetery after a couple of weeks had passed. Quote again, I wanted to honor those bones of the tortured human, for them to bring me down ever more. I had wanted to have them with me as a symbol of my guilt, my family's guilt. The peculiar need of expiation and desire for self-tormenting, noticeable in Andrzej's actions, leading to a peculiar ritual of replacement, constitute a perfect exemplification of the automatic response shared by those who felt the need for Poles to accept their responsibility for the atrocities in the dispute triggered by Gross's book. They demanded a painful, terrifying, traumatic, and lofty show. That's the quote from Grzegorz Niziołek, a theater critic and scholar. Thus, still within the codes of the Polish culture of Romanticism, especially its masochistic current. In this context, it is noteworthy to mention two other characters in Brakoniecki's play. The editor of the local newspaper sees events of 1941 from a totally different perspective. It was not the Poles who did that. The instigators and managers were the Nazis, he says. Piotr, another character who comes from the same area and is a 20-something male, has no illusions, for he has the knowledge about the local wartime events hidden from strangers. He says, people keep on telling each other stories about meager Jews who took what after they had died, where they live, whom they had killed. At the same time, he keeps his distance from Andrzej's irrational behaviors and his guilt. Brakoniecki succeeded in capturing the debate on the Jedwabne massacre in the very beginning, starting from the shock caused by the publication of Gross's book, thus creating a breach in the Polish narration of the Shoah at the time, through crystallization of different positions towards the facts which the book presents, up to the activization on the part of the people ready to acknowledge that his is found in neighbors. Expectations of romantic provenience combined with desire of atonement described by Niziołek. Other playwrights who discuss the issues connected with the Jedwabne crimes also make use of the rhetoric of affirmation. They make references to the voice of those whose position in the debate initiated by Gross's book was once described as the morality discourse, and who sustained the postulate of seeing out past in a truth, expressed by Jan Błoński in the memorable conclusion of his essay, The Poor Poles Look at the Ghetto. Therefore, the scholars Krystyna Duniec and Joanna Krakowska are right when they state that the Shoah is present in contemporary Jewish-Polish narration not as a mere historical fact, but as a moral context which allows for reckoning, reviews and discussions regarding Polish faults and blames. Perhaps this is why none of the discussed plays, with the exception of Meyer Part 2, mention Jedwabne by its name. The allusions and mentions found in them, or on the contrary, extended quotations from texts connected with the July 1941 crimes, do not leave any trace of that with regards to Jedwabne and July 1941 being the place and time the plays are modeled on. The fact that the place name is intentionally left out is symptomatic, especially since the factual model of the time of action is so easy to identify. On the one hand, the intentional omission shows the author's desire of universalization, presenting a theater play summary of the widest possible range of issues regarding Polish-Jewish relations during World War II. On the other hand, it clearly shows that the associations which developed in the public awareness around the name of the town, in majority completely superficial, chanted into a peculiar cliché which incorporates several identifiable details. Jedwabne has as such become like a part or a symbol of the above-mentioned relations, a code word which almost immediately evokes a set of associations connected with them and functions as a paradigm. As a result, the reality is the said place regard way of organizing and representing knowledge about the Jedwabne pogrom or other similar pogroms. It is highly significant if we take into account that our playwrights are addressing the people who learned of Gross's publication from the press and television, but have not necessarily looked in neighbors. It can be seen both in Our Class and Mikva by Piotr Trowicki, which are texts of reckoning character. In Słowodzianek, massacre constitutes the fundamental image around which the remaining affects are formed, from forgiveness to desire for vengeance. The playwright reduces the source material and integrates it. Each of the biographies which we learn about, despite being different, as are the circumstances of each character's death, start in the same small town on the benches of one classroom. Słowodzianek tries to account for arguments of all parties, yet in doing so he introduces highly unsettling symmetries, which stem from his attempt at reconciling the crimes committed by Poles with the rhetoric of the defenders of the paradigm of Polish innocence, who wish to place the atrocities, and that's a quote, in the logic of you upon us, we upon you, and dilute them in the sea of reciprocated evil deeds. That procedure appears to be very questionable. It's not beneficial to the recipients, but also depletes the discussion about Polish-Jewish relations and completely obviates it. Mikva's author has adopted a strategy which is different, yet equally risky, and in fact doomed to fail, which I shall return to later, when I discuss the play in detail. He focuses on the character of a Polish neighbor murderer, while trying to make the recipients aware of the magnitude of his crime. The main character of his text returns to the events of his youth when he is on his deathbed, in order finally to acknowledge his guilt, which he has continued to deny, and to give an account of his participation in the mass murder years ago. Małgorzata Sikorska-Miszczuk, in both her texts, inspired by Anna Biekon's exclusive about Krzysztof Godlewski, Mayor of Jedwabne, portrays an individual who single-handedly fights for a dignified commemoration of the victims and the acceptance of the truth about Paul's perpetration of the murders. At one point, the main character states, "I said that the truth would reach us. Those who passed away, who lie there at the cemetery which does not exist, it was our fathers who killed, not a German." The collectivity is outraged by his words and responds succinctly, "What the fuck do we need this truth for?" Sikorska-Miszczuk tries to center the attention around the question of social resistance to the need to reformulate our national narration about wartime. The main character is eventually killed. The inhabitants weigh him down with a monument of gold, platinum, and pearls. The past has been buried yet again. The same issues return in The same issue returns in Mayor Part 2, which is variation on the subject from the previous text. The mayor's effort to commemorate the victims and quotations from speeches given on anniversaries which contain pleading for forgiveness are juxtaposed against the voices which are against dwelling on the past, express their different stance, or perceive Gross's book as another element of so-called the Jewish propaganda, which besmears the good name of the Polish nation. At the level of setting, her play discusses local disputes about the shape of the memory of 1941 by actual repetition of the same statements of the opposing parties with different words. Nevertheless, the apparently significant fact is that in this very play, which is the latest from the discussed ones, Sikorska-Miszczuk uses the name Jedwabne and resigns from crypto quotations by referring directly to Gross and his book. For we can treat this gesture of revealing the source as a result of the writer's hopelessness, read it as a sign of the impasse which the play is referring to the Jedwabne issue are in, due to the author's declaration of the desire to reveal the truth about the past, and their conviction of the necessity to face it. It is difficult to say to what extent this reading matter is licensed, but it is a fact that the discussed texts are so deeply rooted in the debate caused by the publication of Neighbors that it turns out to be the main weakness, as it sentences authors to move along the beaten furrows of the positions and attitudes set earlier, and to refer to the paradigm or even to reproduce them. That is how writers get into a vicious cycle, which can be explained in the following manner. We will say what is already known, so that we are understood, which in turns make it impossible for the plays to rise above illustrativeness, didacticism, multiplication of obviousness, and equitabilities. This strategy does not stem from the writer's bad intentions, but on the contrary, its source is their desire to fully realize the most rightful of the postulates of memory. The issue is that there is a thin line between a compromise which facilitates the rapport with the audience and conformism, which is based on meeting their needs, and therefore the measures implemented by playwrights can be counterproductive and simply solidify the status quo. It is worthwhile to return to the completely misguided strategy of presenting the Polish guilt, which has already been indicated above and which was adopted by Piotrowicki in Mikwa. The main character of the play is 85-year-old Jan Zapieszka. Unimaginable character, burdened with negative features, dumb anti-Semite, primitive ultra-Catholic, stupid art-pole, disgusting elderly sexist, a persona so unpleasant and vicious that words are not enough. That's a quote from one of the critics. The playwright's intention was for such a character to allow for radical and ruthless strike aimed at the viewers or readers' contentment, as they are proponents of the lofty narration about Poland's past. As you might expect, the effect of this procedure is entirely different. The character is accompanied by his wife, 2 brothers and 2 grandchildren, who are also portrayed in a simplified, stereotypical manner. In fact, the role of the grandchildren is limited to raising the subject of a past, which is protected by the conspiracy of silence in a small town, protected by blood ties and joint interest of the perpetrators. It can be easily seen both in euphemistic allusions on that day in July then, and on stage when the dying main character dictates a letter to his younger brother and makes a point to remind him, "You're not my brother, I saw you talk to that Jewish gorgon from the paper." The letter is addressed to Generalissimus Stalin and somewhat explains the creation of the protagonist, as it is easy to recognize by paraphrased self-description of Jedwabnenski, one of the pogrom participants, which is quoted by Cross. Despite the fact that the main character has been haunted by the ghost of Mendel the Jew, whose daughter was raped and strangled by Sapieshka, which comes to tell him that his time is coming, he is adamant that he is innocent. He even thinks the sentence he was given for his participation in the crime is unfair. Quote, "I confess to everything in that case. You, Mendel, would confess that you had crucified Christ if they made you sit on an unplaned table leg." The character also assures that he did not want to give his barn, but others chose it and took it by force. He talks about the Nazi troop who carried out the pogrom, saying, there were very few of us, other were crowds. Still, Mendel's response leaves no doubt. "I saw that weapon, Sapieshka. I saw that Wehrmacht you talk of. I had seen that Wehrmacht for 30 years, and it was not Wehrmacht. I had known everyone by their first and last name, after their father and mother, and they never said they were German." Conversation with Mendel allow for even more detailed presentation of the protagonist's viewpoint, full of stereotypes about Jewish people which refer to religion, economy, and society. Rawicki is consistent in using a technique similar to the way he constructed the main character. The accumulation of stereotypes is great or even absurd, which leads to a grotesque effect. The character of Mikva is supposed to encompass the worst characteristic of a Polish society on the one hand, and on the other hand has traits of a Jedwabne murderer. The consistency with which he claims he is innocent represents the voices of fierce resistance to the information about Poles' perpetration of the 1941 crimes. Regardless, it is evident in the statements used in the debate provoked by Gross's book, which are repeated in Rawicki's text. For instance, the character's younger brother says they dressed gendarmes in civilian clothes and that's it. There was a motorcycle with a sidecar and 3 uniforms in it, at every corner. How are we guilty? If we consider the steadfastness with which the main character speaks of the damage and how he was pushed to the extreme of anti-Semitism, it is difficult to imagine any motivation which prompts him to make an admission of guilt and air a warning for the future generations. That's a quote. "I'm confessing to you, my son, and I'm talking to you, grandchildren, do not sin by neglect. I raped, I stabbed with pitchfork, even though others were just standing and looking. I, human, another human, my neighbor and brother burned with flames." Regardless of the curious character of the scene, we need to note that Rawicki seems to have forgotten about the fact that the murderers and their victims came from different backgrounds. It's even more surprising because a couple pages earlier the character boasts, "I chased them to the market, they were scratching the ground with spoons while we were peeing on them, just like that. Because this is our land, and we can do whatever we wish on it." I have to shorten it a bit. Okay. What we can see here is a desperate attempt at awakening the audience to the magnitude of Polish guilt. However, the author offers a defense mechanism to the audience by creating the character of a degenerate at the very beginning, so that no one is even least surprised that he was one of the murderers or has a chance to identify with the character, even though Sapieshka declares, "I am a regular man like my father's father." Shall the viewer lack awareness or be someone who represents the paradigm of Polish innocence, the issue is pretty straightforward and possibly unplanned by Rawicki. Even if that viewer wanted to remain skeptical about the character's declaration of innocence, they might leave the theatre with confidence that all Poles who were among the murderers were representatives of the social margin and absolutely not representative of the whole society, which thus cannot be held accountable by the crime committed in Jedwabne. That results in the further petrification of the positions in the debate formed over a decade earlier, despite the writer's plan for them to be challenged and changed, at least partially. Consequently, playwrights' noble intentions turn out to be insufficient in the best-case scenario, whereas in the worst-case scenario they reassure the society in their conviction that the most difficult work has already been done. None of these discussed plays has managed to go outside the pattern rooted in the Polish culture, which essentially enables Poles to face Polish sins in a way which is always most agreeable for them. That should by no means shock or surprise anyone if we take into account the dependency of the discussed plays on the debate following the publication of Gross's book. As a matter of fact, they reproduce the rhetoric formed around it, while they do not expose it in any way, as they do not search for ambiguities, but merely stop at the level of illustrating the issue and passing on the knowledge, which is the didactic level. Okay, finished here. Thank you.